This report contains graphic images. Viewer discretion is highly advised. There is a power moving through the desert of Syria and Iraq faster than any invading army or sandstorm. Their influence and wealth grow by the day. Their acts of extremism and terror grow by the hour. Join me, Avi Oren, as we explore the Wahhabi terrorist group known as ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, in this special edition of American Empire.
Calling for a state of emergency after hundreds of gunmen took control of strategic parts of the northern city of Mosul. Our senior international correspondent Nick Robertson tracking this story from Doha in Qatar for us. Nick, a stunning defeat for government forces, but really it hasn't come from nowhere. It's been building for months, from Anbar in the west to Samarra, Bukaba and Baghdad, now Mosul.
ISIS is a former affiliate with the terrorist network Al-Qaida, who supported ISIS in Syria and Iraq until recently. The aim of ISIS is to install a caliphate, a Sunni region of Syria and Iraq where they can impose Sharia law and rule as its government. Although ISIS officially formed in 2007 as the Al-Qaida affiliate ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, they can trace their roots back to the invasion of Iraq by US forces in 2003. They achieved their notoriety during the civil war in Syria, where they now control hundreds of square miles of territory and villages. After amassing manpower, money, and weapons caches, ISIS now rivals the size, scope, and funding of many nations' armies. ISIS already controls vast amounts of land, military bases, including former US bases, and major cities across Iraq, and shows no sign of stopping. Although ISIS began its major combat operations in Syria in 2011, it has now begun its assault on Iraq.
An Iraqi city where some of the fiercest fighting took place in the early years of the Iraq War is now in the hands of forces linked to Al-Qaida. Insurgents have seized Fallujah in western Iraq. This is the worst violence against the Iraqi government since U.S. forces left the country in December of 2011.
In January 2014, a devastating force moved into the city of Fallujah, Iraq, and took control from the Iraqi government. Iraq's Anbar province was the scene of a bloody three-way war between ISIS, local tribes, and the Iraqi security forces for control of the city. During the chaos, ISIS stormed into the city and by nightfall on January 3, 2014, had raised its black flag on government buildings in Fallujah. Before that, Anbar province was the scene of some of the deadliest combat U.S. forces faced since the Vietnam War. An estimated one-third of the 4,486 U.S. deaths in Iraq were caused by Al-Qaida in Iraq, the main militant movement that would later spawn ISIS almost a decade later. Fallujah was then used as a staging ground for what can only be compared to as a blitzkrieg by ISIS forces 6 months later after its fall. The capture of Fallujah made headlines around the world, only to quickly fall by the wayside and into obscurity of the mainstream media and American social consciousness.
We now have the full autopsy results for actor Paul Walker. The report shows the Fast and Furious star did not have drugs or alcohol in his system when he died in a fiery crash in November.
Frozen's billion-dollar box office. Disney's Frozen is officially the highest-grossing animated movie of all time.
Iron Man's box office gold. Iron Man 3 remains in first place at the box office for the second week, earning $72.5 million.
So what does it tell us? It tells us, one, the plane took off, it tells us where it went, the direction, and tells us that it was missing.
So that's like the duh factor of this report.
That is the duh factor.
In the 6 months since the capture of Fallujah, over 7,500 Iraqis have died in the sectarian violence heavily led by Al-Qaida, ISIS, and other Wahhabi militias. Since the capture of Fallujah, ISIS has blazed a path across the Iraqi desert, taking the cities of Mosul, Baji, Tikrit, Samarra, and are heading towards the cities of Jalula with Baghdad as its ultimate goal.
This is not good, though.
It's not good.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, though, too, as we're going to talk about Mosul and Tikrit, obviously on the way potentially to Baghdad. You say it's less about speed and more about momentum.
It really is. You know, when you talk about speed and the speed of the operations, the speed that concerns me was the collapse of the Iraqi military in the vicinity of Mosul and then en route to Tikrit. This is a major line of communications. You have to control this if you're eventually going to get to Baghdad,
right,
conducting operations from this location. So once you gain some speed vis-a-vis the enemy,
right,
it's all about momentum, and you're not going to stop. And that's what we see right now is ISIS increasing its rate of momentum.
While only 3.5% of Muslims consider themselves followers of Wahhabism, the movement is considered to be one of the most extreme and fundamental of all Islamic beliefs. Al-Qaeda is considered one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in the world and is a major supporter of Wahhabism and Sharia law. The organization START conducted an analysis of terrorist attacks around the world in 2012 and concluded that over 8,500 terrorist attacks killed almost 16,000 people. 6 of the 7 deadliest terror groups that year were affiliates of Al-Qaeda. As the country of Iraq descends into collapse, we take a look into how this was all started.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war. These are opening stages of what will be a broad and concerted campaign. More than 35 countries are giving crucial support, from the use of naval and air bases to help with intelligence and logistics to the deployment of combat units. Every nation in this coalition has chosen to bear the duty and share the honor of serving in our common defense.
Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off.
People have been gathering in Salmania's main square for nearly 3 months now, protesting what they allege is government corruption, nepotism, incompetence, and anti-democratic measures. Since then, at least 12 civilians have been killed across Iraqi Kurdistan, as military forces of the ruling parties were deployed in the restive areas. The protests and the accompanying violence have pushed the government and the opposition parties further away from each other than ever. Masoud Barzani, the president of the region, recently accused the opposition of trying to stage a coup, an accusation that is vigorously rejected.
The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president, in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein, was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
When the United States invaded Iraq, it left a major power vacuum that it could not fill. After many attempts at stabilizing the Iraq